San Ignazio, Fra Andrea Pozzo's ceiling in San Ignazio, the home church of the Jesuits, which is just a spectacular ceiling. Pozzo, if you're not familiar with it, invent a whole new system of perspective, because the painting is on a barrel vault. And so you have to figure out how to do perspective, which is intended to be on a flat surface, on a barrel vault. And there's a whole book about it, there's a whole system of that. A little too much to go into that. And of course, over the crossing, the Jesuits ran out of money and couldn't do the cupola, and so he painted a false view of a cupola, which looks skewed here because you're directly underneath it, but from the nave looks to be correct. The kind of thing that also happens, as you see in Loyola's apartment off the side of the Jesu, and you see one view from the correct perspective on the left, and then you see how distorted it can look when it's seen from a different point of view. So I worked in Rome. I was doing a lot of painting. I was essentially a student painter in Rome, and benefiting from studio visits from other artists who were living there, and working away, and trying to figure out how I wanted to approach some of these ideas. I got back to, I was always an abstract painter, I have to say, that I was always involved in a kind of, I guess, architectural form. So my immediate interest in painting didn't have to do with representation as much as it had to do with just manipulation of color and form. And my first love as a painter was Franz Klein's work. I remember he died while I was in school, and we all went down to Washington to see a memorial exhibit of his work, and that was a very strong experience. And so I was working a lot in black and white, and then eventually in other formats. And when I got back to New York, I started reading a lot about color and other books which would school me a little bit more in how one experiences space and time and walking through space and time. I realized that there was a lot of information already developed about how the eye-brain system works, how the human body takes in experiences of color and experiences of pattern and space and form, and how you basically construct your sense of reality, and that this is really a very active enterprise by each of us. That is, we are not passive observers of the world. We are constantly constructing our notions of the three-dimensional world that's out there. After all, the image comes to our retina upside down and reversed, and there's a blind spot in the middle of the retina that we're normally not aware of, and the cones and the rods of the eye are in the back of the retina, not the front, so they have to go through all the ganglion cells and all of the other different kinds of cells that are joining these things together. The light has to go through all of that to the back of the retina to find its way to the rods and cones, where it is finally received and processed in some way, and then streamed back through the optic nerve to the cortex, and then the cortex somehow constructs this view that you have of me standing here and I have of you sitting out there. It's an active process, and a lot of it has to do with our search for information in the world. That is, that we're reaching out looking for information in the world. And the more we ask of the environment we're in, the more information and experience we're going to get out of it. And so I realized that there were people who had done some research on this and worked on it. Of course, one was Joseph Albers. And when I got back to New York in January of '66, I immediately buried myself in his book, which had come out in 1963. I was never a student of Albers. Some people think I was a student of Albers. I never met Albers, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I'm not sure. And his book was kind of fresh at that point. And if you're not familiar with it, the original edition in '63 was like this, a box set of about 200 or so silkscreen prints. with lots of color experiences to go through, and with Alvar's cryptic writing. And that was a kind of start. And of course, I got familiar with the work of Chevreul. Chevreul was a famous color theorist of the 19th century in France. He was the head of the Gobelin Tapestry Works, and he gave lectures that Delacroix went to, and then published a book on color that became famous with the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists. And like all good color theorists, lived to the age of 103. And he was the one who kind of popularized the notion of simultaneous contrast and the kind of after images that you see when you fixate on a target of color, that if you fixate on a circle of red, like you see in the upper left, that you start seeing this halo of green around it, and then of course we take away the target, you would see a green dot like that, or a blue-green dot. That is the complementary color. And he juxtaposed that against the idea of assimilation, that is the optical mixing of color. And of course all of this was crucial and important to the Gobelin Tapestry Works, but it became ever more crucial to artists throughout the century. And another important influence was the work of James J. Gibson, who was a psychologist who taught at visual scientist, psychologist who taught at Cornell in the 50s and worked on into the 80s. And he had written this book, Perception of the Visual World, and talked about gradients and density gradients and how you get cues for spatial organization beyond the idea of just perspective, but through these idea of density gradients. And most importantly, Gibson was really the man who pushed the idea that vision and perception is an active experience and not just a passive one of receiving information, but an active one of searching out and looking for information. He started out teaching pilots, figuring out how to teach pilots to land on aircraft carriers when they had no spatial cues around. That was his earliest experience, and then he went on to write these books. This was the first of his most famous books. And then another color theorist was an early Gestalt. I don't have any images of his because there are no images in the book, but David Katz was famous early Gestalt psychologist. This is the English edition that was published in 1935, but it came out in German in 1911, and he was in the lab of Müller, was a famous psychophysicist in German universities in the 19th century, and he was responsible for describing what we call modes of appearance of color. That is, that we see color in different modes of appearance. And the two, he describes about 10, but the two most important ones for the purposes of this talk would be the idea that you can either see color as a surface color, that is when it's attached to the surface of the table, and you see it coincidentally with seeing the table, or the chair, the color of the chair. In other words, your normal experience of color. And he juxtaposed that against what he called film color. And film color is a kind of unfortunate English translation of the German word, but he means a color which is detached from any experience of surface. And he explained it in terms of the kind of color you see when you close your eyes and you're just aware of the light that is coming through your eyelids. In other words, that kind of vague experience of color. But he also had an experience which he called an experiment called the reduction screen, which was an aperture. You would hold up an aperture in front of a color experience, and because you would focus on the edge of the aperture, in other words, the frame, the color would seemingly float and be spatially unlocatable behind it. In other words, not attached to a surface. Many of you have probably experienced Katz's notion of film color by seeing the work of James Turrell, which is a very large-scale aperture experiment of David Katz. And of course, the idea of Gestalt psychology and the kind of reversible figure and figure ground interchange, which I show because it's crucial to certain ideas that I had later on. So I was trying to figure out how I wanted to